This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of the NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you to our holiday show. And equally enthusiastic about Scott Cutler being here, our EVP from the NYSE. Scott, my co-host, welcome. Glad you're off the road. Pleasure to be here for the holiday show.
It's great to be here.
And what do you think? A little snow in the beginning here?
I love cue the snow always.
Cue the snow and look at the backdrop. I mean, do you believe the money that's spent on the creative for this show?
It's amazing.
It is amazing. And we want to thank our people in the control room. They always do a great job at this time of the year. So this is our traditional look back at the key board issues and trends in 2013, okay? So I'm going to take the liberty, just because of my age, I'm going to take the liberty of starting this off. And the most significant thing to me is sort of the change in the overall environment between the relationship of the companies and the company board and shareholders. There is no question in my mind that this year that we have seen sort of what I'll call a rise in shareholder power. I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way, although there's certainly some parts of it that I'm, less than enthusiastic about. And the trigger to this, to me, has been the say on pay, that there is the understanding that there is communication and engagement that is necessary with that. It's a tool that you can send a message, even if it isn't comp related, it can send a message to the board of directors. And when you look at the declassification of boards, which is gradually happening, you look at majority voting that's about 80% in the Fortune 500, and certainly growing in both the mid cap and the small cap. You look at Proxy 452, which is sort of focused that voting. You look at all those things together, and on the shareholder side, there's a sort of a new sense of confidence. And I know you're going to speak about this. Even in the shareholder campaigns, the activist campaigns, 2000 we had 20 of those. 2013, 200. Okay. So when you look at that, there's sort of a sense of confidence from the shareholders' perspective. Even the index funds like the CalPERS and CalSTRs, who were traditionally sort of passive in that. You've seen them go after some companies, the Timken case where they wanted to have that split. So to me, probably the most significant thing is this change in environment that the boards have to get ready, that has happened in 2013, that have to sort of get prepared, which we'll talk about on our next show, 2014.
Yeah. So I mean, I would. The only thing I would add to that is I think the two things that really contribute to that is certainly the decline of a lot of shareholder defenses, and then secondly, as you mentioned, the withhold vote campaigns, and I think that has led to a higher level of engagement from shareholders than we have in the past, and now companies are required to actually engage in those types of discussions. But overall, this level of engagement, I think, in many respects, and Martin Lipton talked about this in a recent article about a plateau in governance, and I think that plateau is mostly the passing of the wave of Sarbanes-Oxley, the wave of Dodd-Frank. While we still have a lot of things implemented, in many respects, boards have checked a lot of those boxes, and I think we're entering into a new phase of more nuanced corporate governance where you're really looking at the application of these principles to the actual strategy of the company and how you engage that strategy with a shareholder base that's continuing to change. And I think that's a challenge for every company today, certainly in the public spotlight. But how is it that you actually engage with those customers? And I think you've seen a lot of different approaches, and we've talked about this probably the last 2 years, but this year, the amount of engagement that companies are having, particularly around disclosure in the proxy statement, and then the actual meetings that companies are having with institutions on areas of governance is probably at its highest level.
Well, the companies, there's no question that the companies are sort of challenged on what the right method is. Okay, and that I think is going to be interesting to see this year. Interestingly enough, all our research shows that directors are very open to communicating with shareholders. Council and management are less open. But what has traditionally happened is when you open those doors, which I think is the olive branch going forward, traditionally people take advantage of that. Single-focused organizations take that opportunity to push their agendas rather than looking at the olive branch that each side is supposed to take a step forward, and that's part of the challenge. And I think one of the topics that you're going to talk about is how some of that has led to shareholder activism.
Yeah. Well, let's transition to my number two.
Okay.
Because or the number two trend. I actually think that the key role of the director hasn't changed, and that still is a focus on long-term strategy, CEO succession, and risk management. And so I would like to talk about number three, which is the role of risk management. This year has been interesting with very public instances around data security, data privacy. With the amount of data, and every company is talking about the role of big data in terms of how a company operates. But data is also distributed, it's outsourced, it's vulnerable, and I think that has big implications and has had big implications for boards as they look at risk and the role that data and data privacy and data security has on overall risk for a company. That's risk to customers, risk to security, risk to operations. And I think that's been something that corporations, governments, everybody has had to deal with in a huge way in 2013.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I agree with it wholeheartedly. I think that it has been a rude awakening, to companies about the risks that's involved. And remember, everybody is carrying multiple devices. You have copiers that have hard drives. You have leased cars that have hard drives. All that information is retained in those places. And as we know, people are very skillful to tap into these sources and just get information. So if you're a company of 50,000 employees that have all these devices out there, I'm not sure that the demographics of the boardroom today completely understand, and certainly our research shows that this is something that they're trying to ask themselves, how do I get my arms around that,
Yeah.
And when you have something, even though you have some very bright people, that you don't know how to get your arms around that risk, that's a challenge.
Yeah. And it's a challenge. And I think that goes to, board composition and the types of individuals that you have on the board. How is it that you're able to, identify the types of individuals that are able to identify and understand and remediate the types of risks that companies can encounter, as well as opportunities. I mean, with all of this rise of data comes tremendous opportunities for understanding your customer engagement, identification of new markets, identification of new processes. This is a powerful tool as well.
Yeah, we almost have the situation as a director. First of all, you need to be able to even know what to ask your own internal people. You have to be able to evaluate your own internal people even before you address the risk on the outside. And, am I, if you have a giant capital expenditure,
right.
Related to all this, to get your arms around understanding that, I think it's certainly going to be a big issue. And I think you're right, 2013 was sort of like the smack in the face that this is something we have to get our arms around.
Yeah. What's the number 3 here?
For me, sort of I think there was a realization this year about board leadership, okay? And in board leadership, I'm talking about in the old days, chairman of the board, lead director was sort of picked on who had time, who might have been the most senior person. But in the last 2 years, we've seen so many occasions where the board has had to step up and sort of take leadership, not only in the sort of the BP or the Bank of America kind of situations, but just in the responsibility of making sure that the board was doing things independently of management. And I think that if the board doesn't have their arms around and understand the importance of that, don't be surprised if the CEO sort of takes control of board guidance. Then shareholders get concerned that the CEO has too much power. Really, they're probably filling a void, okay, on lack of that. So, yes, we still have imperial CEOs out there, but in some cases, it's a CEO saying, I'm missing that, I'm going to provide that. So, to me, I think that as we talk about the environment changing, leadership at the board level is going to become more and more important, and we'll get to the issue that we'll probably talk about next week, which is board composition.
Yeah. I'd say my last point is really around the area of compliance. This is, we always talk about this as the governance, risk, and compliance space. I think 2013, we've seen a lot of convergence in these areas. We're seeing interesting tools being created about how is it that companies can benchmark their compliance programs around the world. Anti-corruption, because that's been regulations that now apply outside of the U.S. Continues to be a huge topic, and I think boards are now looking at how is it that we make sure across the organization that compliance and compliance programs is literally infused into the entire organization, much beyond just the board. But how is it that the idea of governance and compliance really spreads throughout the entire organization? So that would be probably my last contribution to what we saw happen in 2013.
And with that, our advice, I think, to boards is this is something that you have to create a foundational block of, okay? It's a culture thing on how you're handling compliance. And if you can create that foundation, you don't have to spend as much time on it. Where if you don't create that, you're going to be in and out on small things, trying to cover your butt. It is a very important thing to think through foundationally, because the culture of a company and how it makes decisions, you can't be everywhere.
No, and quite literally having those programs, those procedures in place saves companies money as well. There's huge liability for not having many of these programs in place, and so I think it's focused, but quite frankly, you have to today.
Well, that we've eaten up our time on at least taking a look back, and I'm probably most of our audience is more interested in our look forward, which we'll address in what we call our New Year's show that we'll be filming next. But this does give us the chance to say thank you as a year end to a lot of people. As a lot of you know, we enjoyed our 200th show during the year, and Scott and I are not tired of each other, and we hope that you out there are still find our shows challenging and interesting. We have some people to thank here at year end. Certainly Cindy Fernelli and the Center for Audit Quality, their team. You see Cindy on our show bringing a lot of good audit information. They've been great supporters, as has Grant Thornton, who you've seen on the show. We want to thank them for all their support. We also have relationships with NYRE and the Society for Corporate Secretaries, Jeff Morgan and his group at NYRE, and Ken Birch and Darla Stuckey at the Society for Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals. They're great in content. We appreciate their support. I want to thank the people in the booth, Phil, Ave, and Andre, where they keep making sure that we do good in these wonderful creative things that we have on the show. We appreciate that. Scott, I appreciate your busy schedule when you get in. And lastly, audience, we appreciate your support. I know Scott and I feel sometimes you stop us in airports or along the way and talk about things in the show or things that you liked or you didn't like. We appreciate that very much. It's very enjoyable for us to sit down and sort of challenge ourselves on what are the topics to bring each week, and we've kept them interesting. So with that, Scott, I think it's time for us to say goodbye to 2013. And we're looking forward to next year, and we will hope that you'll stay with us each week, where we'll bring up important topics that'll help you be a better director or committee member. And we'll see you then. Fade out to snow.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.